Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And if I may, as a friend of ORF and of course, as a proud Indian, welcome you to the Raisina Dialogue. I have the privilege to welcome you, even though I haven't done any of the work to pull this fantastic session or this entire conference together. But as every other year, we are, I'm sure, in for a big treat. And we have the lucky privilege to be the ones to kick it off. Before you came, sir, they told us that this room was already at capacity. And I think that is a really good tell for how important and critical energy has become in overall geopolitical affairs, but also in how it is no longer a singular niche subject, but something that is, interlinked with every single thing that we do. So bearing that in mind, one of the things that we have discussed as a panel is that every single conference or meeting should have a beginning, a middle, and the end. And the way that I think of that is you have the opportunity to provoke and propose at the start. And then you must consolidate, and then you must conclude. Luckily, we just get to do the first. So we're going to give you a lot of, I hope, radical ideas and new thinking. But also, you will have the opportunity to ask questions, to raise important clarifications with this illustrious panel that Shubh just introduced. But more than anything, I think and I hope it will give you enough food for thought to bring into your deliberations over the next 2 days. At Sustainable Energy for All, where I work, we think very deeply about energy access, not separate from the energy transition, but at the heart of it. To transition into anything or away from anything, you must first have some energy. And if you don't have energy, you have no transition. And energy access is often seen to be as a parallel line to climate action. But in reality, if all of the people in the world that today don't have access to electricity, and if that access to electricity was given to them from coal as opposed to from renewable energy sources, that would be 1.3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, which is a third of all global NDC commitments. So energy access is not about a hut in rural Bangladesh with a panel that may be able to put one kind of phone charger, a light bulb, and a fan, but it really is, as this session says, can power and drive an energy revolution, but also a global market revolution. And we're seeing this increasingly, most recently and perhaps unapologetically in India's presidency of the G20. And the G20 has come a long way from being a discussion between finance ministers about fiscal room and fiscal governance to a much more inclusive conversation. And India played a really strong role in driving that shift. And so who better than the G20 Sherpa for India, who's had resounding victory recently in getting a strong communique that had very important language on energy in there, but also that talked about energy beyond tokenism. It wasn't just about what kind of fuels, but it was about the entire value chain of energy, from minerals to manufacturing to deployment to transition to local communities. So, sir, I'd like you to start us off and kick off today's discussion by talking about why is energy so central to the process?
So, Kanika, thanks for that. We had 83 paras in the G20 communique. We had a consensus on all issues, but I think the most critical and the most important of the G20 communique was the Green Development Pact of the leaders. And the G20 communique on the Green Development Pact had several components to it. I think the most critical of which was tripling renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency. There was also components on building a consensus towards green hydrogen and the biofuel alliance. All these were critical. But, it's important to first to understand that even if we have 100% electricity, all our electricity is converted into renewable energy, that's only 20% of energy. The balance 80% of energy in the case of all developed countries and developing countries is use of fossil fuel for steel, for cement, for long distance transport, for fertilizer, in refineries. All these are what is known as hard to abate sectors. So it's not electricity which is critical, it's important to decarbonize hard to abate sectors. And you cannot do it unless and until India, for instance, imports 180 billion worth of fossil fuel. And the challenge for us is that by the time we become 12047, instead of being an importer of energy, we should be an exporter of energy. And that means that we produce more and more of renewable, crack water, and use the process of electrolyzer to produce green hydrogen. And to my mind, that's the challenge for the world, that you move towards decarbonization by producing green hydrogen. And by green hydrogen, that means that you will be able to decarbonize all the hard to abate sector. The challenge on green hydrogen right now is that it requires global action. It can't be done by one individual country alone. Countries like United States of America, which are very critical to it, are pursuing a very protectionist policy through their CHIPS Act and by the Inflation Reduction Act, saying that we will provide subsidization only for green hydrogen produced in the United States of America. The second big challenge for the world is to decarbonize transport, which in the case of two-wheelers, three-wheelers will be, and four-wheelers will be batteries, and therefore the world will have to go through the battery route. And for long-distance transport, it'll have to be green hydrogen. And the third key challenge to my mind is about using a lot of more biofuels, because that will really produce better, that'll give a better livelihood to citizens in countries. It'll ensure that you are able to mix biofuel to an extent of 20, 30, 35%. In a place like Brazil, you go up to 80%, but biofuel will provide a source of livelihood to the citizens. The fourth key fuel to my mind will be small modular reactors. They will be critical because then you can integrate small modular, on a modular basis, you can do a lot of nuclear energy development from in a very big way and integrate it with the grid and take care of the intermittency of the grid. This will serve as the base load for the grid. And therefore, these are critical for the world to move towards. The big energy transition will happen through this, but my personal view is that green energy transition really requires a huge global push towards green hydrogen. And that would require global action by all of us. Now, all this in the case of developing countries, if you realize, requires huge resources. The total carbon space available to the world, 2,800 gigatons, 80% of it has already been occupied by the developed world. They've left nothing for the developing world. And the developing world still has to industrialize, still has to urbanize. And therefore, for them, the challenge for the developed world is to cut down emissions very sharply, bring down their net zero from what some of them have talked about 2050 to 2040. And for the challenge for developing countries is to really ensure that their process of manufacturing and their process of urbanization should be through a decarbonized process. India must take the lead in being the first country in the world to industrialize and urbanize without carbonizing itself. And it is driving, it is it has a great track record of having done 185 gigawatt of green energy. It has brought in huge amount of policy measures. It's brought in cutting edge technology. It has raised financial resources through both the private and public funding. And it has really brought in private capital and private entrepreneurship to push 185 gigawatt. And its next big mission is to drive the production of green hydrogen. The cost of green hydrogen is about close to $5 per kilogram. The challenge for all of us is to bring it down to $1 per kilogram by 2030. And that is the big challenge for the world towards. These are the big challenges.
Mr. Kant, I think you took me really seriously and you've given a lot of homework to this audience of what they must do and the strides they must make, not just in the next 2 days, but really as we go back to our day jobs and see how we can work together. But a lot of what you said, I'm sure, would resonate quite closely with Minister Krapa as well, especially because we worked along with the government of Ghana to develop its energy transition plan. And one of the things you kept telling us, Minister, was it's not just about decarbonizing our energy mix and extending energy access. It's about green industrialization and creating improved access to jobs and livelihoods for local communities. So can you talk about why energy is now central to economic policy making as well, and how this has come to be, and the role of energy planning in economic planning?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kanika. And I think, just like you, I should also commend the organizers, ORF, and whoever has helped to put this together. I had not been to the Raisina Dialogues, but colleagues back at home in Ghana have been attended to it, and they speak very highly of the sessions, and clearly the testimony that they share is really befitting. We participated last year at the G20 as well, and we were very excited that energy was, central to most of the conversations that were going on. Essentially, because we've suddenly realized that the transitioning into cleaner fuels has become inevitable and non-negotiable for both developed and developing countries. I continue to say that our hope is that, all the talk about renewables is not just being found to be exciting, but action must back the talk. And that is crucial to places like developing economies, where energy plays a very central role in growth, socio-economic growth and development. We worked with you, the SE for All, to build our energy transition framework into an investment plan. Now, that decarbonization pathway means that we have to strike that balance. We're very heavily dependent on fossil fuels. Some 85 to 90% of the infrastructure we have in the country is dependent on fossil fuels. So we have to clearly appreciate that the architecture that exists today is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and that transitioning requires a critical understanding of what we need to do it seamlessly, to make sure that it is just, and to make sure that jobs are not lost, people's economic livelihoods are not, taken away from them. And two main things, stand out. Cost of capital. We continue to talk about pace and upscale of renewable energies in the transitioning. But if you look at it critically, you find that the high cost of capital, initial capital, to get these projects going is pricing it outside of emerging and developing economies. And that really is a conversation that we have to have. Because otherwise, for instance, if you take the case of Ghana, we have something about between 4 to 5% of our energy mix being renewables. Our plan is to push that to something above 10% by 2030. But the investment, and then the other issue that you have to also critically look at is the access even to this capital. Global population growth, these emerging developing economies, 2/3 of global population growth is coming from these economies. But you are finding only 1/3 of energy investments going into these economies. And what is even more staggering, 1/5, 20% only in renewables. So that's a conversation that we really critically need to have. If you listen to African ministers of energy, heads of state in developing economies, you find that there's very strong appetite for upscaling renewables. But the handicap is really the access to the finance. If it is 1%, 2% on capital for economies in Europe, for instance, in the north, you are seeing something averaging 20% cost of capital in Africa. And that really is very discouraging to the process and to the transitioning. We in Ghana believe that we have to tackle electricity generation. Really, currently we have hydro and thermal contributing significantly to our generation. We have some close to 50 megawatts in solar. We have done just recently the floating solar on our second biggest hydro generator. And we're looking to, scale that up. The work that we have done with SE for All ensures that we're able to package some of these solar projects. And we've done significant work in terms of getting the feasibility out of the way, making sure that these projects are bankable. But as you know, for instance, in Ghana, we are with the fund, and there's limitation as to how much you can put on your balance sheet. And so some grant arrangements, concessionary crowd financing, patient capital, blended financing, innovation really in ensuring that we're able to have access to the capital market and be able to do these projects is really what I'm hammering. Just like Minister has mentioned, we too believe that the mix has to be gas, renewables, solar in particular, and also the base load has to be small SMRs. And so that's the focus that we have. In terms of the transport sector, we've just launched our EV policy at the COP. I think Kanika, you were there. And we're looking to take advantage of the critical green minerals that we have. We have just discovered significant deposits of lithium. And the first agreement that we have signed ensures that there will be no exports of the raw materials. We're looking to build a value chain so that through manufacturing, through deployment, job creation, the technology is there. And the contract also ensures that if the holder of the concession is not able to put up the factory for the processing, a third party is brought in to be able to do the processing. So we're clear in our minds about taking advantage of critical green minerals. We're clear about decarbonizing the transport sector, electricity generation. We have, I think, the highest on the continent electricity access of 88.85. What we have left is what we're calling the last mile, the island communities. Some about 200 communities, islands with over 2,000 communities spanning 23 districts across the Volta Lake. And we're deploying mini grids to take care of those areas. So we have a strong appetite for transitioning into renewables. But we're handicapped in terms of how much financing we're able to attract into that agenda. And I think that should also take center stage in some of these conversations.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's not just about affordability of capital, as you said, Minister, but it's also about access to that capital. And how do we address some of the risk perceptions that exist, especially for developing countries. But one of the things that I really appreciated about both Mr. Kant as well as Minister Krapa's interventions is that this opportunity of the energy transition, right? So it's seen to be as not something that is happening to developing and emerging economies, but something that can actually benefit them and can perhaps set right some of the inequities of the energy markets of yesterday. So Manal, in your work, what do you find are some of the key opportunities for addressing these inequities?
Thanks very much. So maybe addressing the inequities, as you mentioned, I want to tie it back to something you said earlier about the G20 becoming more inclusive. And I think while the discussion had kind of shifted from ministers of finance, energy in a lot of the G20 countries also affects directly finance, right? So it is really intricately linked. It's not separate from the finance discussion. And globally, as we've seen, a push towards the transition to clean energy sources away from fossil fuels, that is really, if you really look at it, and I think Minister has kind of talked a little bit about it with the global north having really used the carbon amount that we have for the world, so to speak, the carbon budget. There's, I think, often we see that there is obviously an inequity within each country, but also across countries. And the energy transitions for long felt like, the global north is trying to have the global south really pay for the energy access in the global north. And you see that also with a lot of the hydrogen projects, for example, with interest in having investments in whether it's the Middle East or Africa by European countries, for example, a lot of it aiming at supporting exports and needs of the industrial economies. And I think some of the shifts that we've seen, and we've seen this also in some of the G20 talks when G20 was in Saudi Arabia in 2020, is also kind of really bringing back fossil fuels in the talk as well of energy access. And obviously that needs a lot of access to technology, some of which we don't really have now, but carbon solutions, but also looking at ways that you can, I think, not only expand access to the north, but also within the south. And a wonderful example is what Minister you've mentioned in Ghana is also expanding energy access, because you have still, I think, till now, about 750 million people in the world, most of whom are in Africa, without access to electricity. And this is separate from 2.6 billion or so people without access to clean cooking fuel. So this is really imperative. And one of the challenges that we is having expanding renewable or hydrogen or other projects that are only looking at expanding export markets to really continue to support the appetite of Europe and other countries for their energy, but also through clean energy sources, is how do we make sure that then these countries also in the developing world can also expand their energy access, can also then have affordable but also clean. So you have a double energy access problem. It's not just that it's just clean energy. It is really access to energy first and foremost. So that is the first challenge. And then of course we need to make that energy also clean and affordable and reliable. And then the other link as well is, and I think Minister, you slightly touched upon it in terms of how do you ensure that not a lot of jobs are being lost. In some countries where there is a lot of poverty, for example, I work quite a bit on women and I'm interested in that. So a lot of women we see go and they're, unpaid labor and they go and bring, energy sources at home. If you have energy access to these families, these women can go and work and have actual development for them and their families. But in other parts of the world, South Africa is a great example, in India as well, women who work in coal, for example, how do you ensure that these, if they lose their jobs, they can then find other jobs that could also support them and ensure that there is really development throughout the communities. And then we also hear about, green energy or new energy sources will also provide a lot of jobs. And my personal opinion on that is there is a bit of I think there's an exaggeration of what these industries will bring in terms of jobs. A lot of them are actually capital intensive, so they're going to involve more capital than labor. But the trick will be how do you then ensure that the development that's coming out of that can then translate into other sectors beyond energy, so that you can actually have labor opportunities, new employment opportunities, new development opportunities in these other sectors, because the employment opportunities are far larger in other non-energy sectors than in energy, as far as I can see. And that trick requires then more of a cohesive policy framework that at the moment isn't there in a lot of countries. It's more silos, but it needs to become more cohesive.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this is, it's really important to think about kind of the knock-on effects, right? So it's not just about access to electricity for consumptive load, but also for productive load, for income generating activities. And Munya, if I can bring that to you, I think we're speaking so much about this intersectionality of energy and perhaps, we were talking about economic policy or development, but equally, I think it's really important to kind of think about there's a lot of competing uses on public money all over the world, in developed countries, in developing countries, and emerging economies. We're seeing, there's no part of the world that is currently unaffected by some version of an energy and cost of living crisis. In the face of this, when there is this kind of often perceived as an added burden on developing countries that are also vulnerable to climate change or more vulnerable to climate change, what are some of the drivers for making sure that energy doesn't take a backseat?
Before responding to your question, which is very relevant, I want before to highlight some points. First, we all agree that energy transition give great potential for developing countries and emerging countries. That's, I think, the facts, and we know that we should, all the countries should work on that. But the impact and the effect of energy transition on countries differ from country to another. And I think there are at least three reasons, major reasons. The first one is the level of development in the country, socio-economic development. The second is technological development. And the third is the presence of supportive regulation and policies. And it's not easy for developing countries to establish their roadmap just by importing some concepts or some solutions. They have to find specific solutions that give more sustainable resolution of problem. And many countries are facing other challenges like food security, lack of infrastructures, water scarcity, and there are many priorities to tackle. And if they have to move their transition, they should be sure that in this way they will find solution to all the other problems, and that they are addressing all the problems. What we have seen recently, you mentioned the example of Bangladesh that are developing, yes, the local house solar house system. I think that is kind of very successful project because they have found solution to improve the accessibility with very competitive cost, and in the same time they found solution to families by giving access to microfinance to have this kind of solution, and that's it's in the same time you have a transition, energy transition, and at the same time you have inclusivity in finance. So that's kind of where we should find innovative solution for the problem. You should address by the good perspective and not just import. Sometimes, yes, some countries are importing some technologies and it's not they are not efficient. Another potential what I want to mention is related to what you have said, that with emerging technologies we can improve, we can have more industrial activities in developing countries, especially logistics, services, maintenance, and others. But if you want to create this new value chain with new actors, it's important also to address all what we have as factors of competitiveness. Because what we see now is the development of technologies, especially production of parts, electrolyzers, photovoltaic spares, and others, they are concentrated in some countries. And we are just moving from the dependency from fossil producer or technology producer to another kind of dependency with also a low level of resilience. So that's also one point we should highlight when we talk, yes, there is potential for developing countries to be more industrialized, to be more active, or to integrate the value chain, the world value chain. The reality now on the ground, we see that all the technologies are being developed by few countries, and there are no space for the others. We can see that many developing countries present the potential of resources, renewable energy, critical materials, but there are what we see that there are less added value. I can take the example of critical minerals. They are exported without any additional added value. So for countries, even they are how can I say, they are very strategic in the global supply chain, but they don't benefit. And we should promote more green investment in countries, just to make this advantage and to share the advantage. That's I think that should be the values that should support the energy transition. And Minister talked about green hydrogen. Of course, that's the new potential for countries to become exporters and to export green hydrogen or ammonia. But until now, yes, the big issue is finance and how you can finance, because the market is not still established, and we don't have a very competitive cost. And if you want to promote the green ammonia or green hydrogen, we need, yes, to address all the supply chain from industrialization to distribution, storage, and of course, how we can have a solution to distribution to other countries, and how we can export. So all that points needs from countries that want to be part of this big market to invest a lot in technologies and research and development. If they don't, they couldn't aspire to be one of influent parts in this supply chain. And then maybe you can continue on the other point.
Thank you so much. I think this is, it's even though we're bringing up so many different but related topics, I think it all kind of links back to a new energy paradigm as we're thinking about it, right? Which has green hydrogen and critical minerals and a new energy marketplace. And so, Timur, if I can turn to you, 50 years ago, the IEA was set up to support and maintain energy security. And today, energy security looks dramatically different than it did 50 years ago. With several of these elements that everybody else on the panel has brought up. So what do you think are some of the critical levers that yet need to be exerted in order to create a more energy secure future?
Yeah, so thank you very much, first and foremost, to the organizers for this excellent event. I would like to echo what my predecessors here have said, and thank you very much to put me at the end of such a distinguished panel, because they have covered so much ground, I don't know what to add, to be very frank with you. Maybe let me start with the energy security angle. I think it's important that we recognize, we talk a lot about how energy is back on the agenda. You talked about finance ministers, etc. But questions like energy security are really old. They're 50 years old easily. The IEA was founded in 1974 to deal with the fallouts of the oil crisis. So an oil security mechanism. Why is this so important? It's a simple point that has also been made. It is access to energy that fuels prosperity, that keeps our economies running, that gives us access to light, to cars, to whatever it is, to our industries needed. So it is a very important ingredient that keeps our economies running and helps our livelihood. What has changed really since the 70s, and that's what I think you're referring to here, is the scope. That has changed considerably. This is no longer just about oil. It became very quickly about gas and electricity. The IEA was actually receiving a mandate when it went through a modernization phase back in 2015 to deal with gas security questions as well as electricity security questions, because they're just as essential as oil security questions. But of course, increasingly, it is the topic of critical minerals too, because critical minerals are an important part of our value chains to produce clean energy technologies. We have a new mechanism that we're currently setting up to help deal with these kind of security questions around critical minerals. But it's a new question that is coming and that we have to deal with. In fact, critical mineral supplies are more heavily concentrated geographically than oil and gas. So it's something that we need to be dealing with. There are multiple other challenges that come with energy, of course. Many have been touched upon. Energy is roughly 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from energy. So this is about climate change. It is about energy access. The most sincere or the most basic energy security concern is lack of access to energy. If you don't have it, you have a real issue. Air pollution is a critical question. But another one that was also coming through with what Munia just said is really about the resilience of clean energy technology supply chains. They're heavily geographically concentrated, and this is not only about critical mineral supply, where it's really whether you have a resource or not that determines whether you can be an actor in the supply chain, but it's about all these other elements that have been mentioned. It's about processing of critical minerals. You're not going to use critical minerals directly, but you have to turn them into materials that can be used afterwards in wind turbines, in batteries, etc., etc. This is heavily geographically concentrated and in one country alone, essentially. you also need other materials like steel, like aluminium, like cement. All of that are established industries. We are producing these kind of materials at orders of magnitude that are larger by orders of magnitude compared to critical minerals. So it's a very established business, but also very geographically concentrated in 3 top producing countries. And when you then look at clean energy technology manufacturing, so what everyone is excited about, the solar PV panels, the batteries, the electrolyzers, the wind turbines, the heat pumps, actually. This 80 to 90% of the production capacity is in the 3 top producing countries alone. And why is this a problem? I would not call it a security problem per se. There's a different security angle, energy security angle, than it is when you have a disruption in oil markets. It's a very it's an immediate effect into your economy. If you don't have access for a solar PV panel for 6 months, it's a bit of a different challenge that you are dealing with, and so the mechanisms to deal with that are somewhat fundamentally different. But there's a resilience question associated with it. So disruptions in the supply chains, especially when they're so geographically concentrated, can increase the cost of production, and as a result, can make the transition or the use of these kind of technologies more costly. And there is, of course, a question of participation, and that as well was resonating a bit in, and I very much associate myself with what Munia said here earlier. If you don't produce, these are the new industries. No, these are industries that were in the infancy 20 years ago for solar PV, for wind, just 10 years ago for electric cars and batteries, but they are vast manufacturing operations today, and we are at the cusp of a new industrial age here. And if you're not producing these kind of technologies at home, you don't reap the economic benefits. It's not the same. It's not an energy security question, but it's an economic participation question. Can every country do that? Is another question, I think, that has to be debated, because of course you need a certain set of skills, you need to have a certain industrial base potentially to do it. But in all these kind of supply chain steps, there's a lot of potential to participate for emerging economies as well as advanced economies alike. And yeah, maybe we can pick that up later in the discussion.
Yeah. Actually, I think that's a really important point around scale. And I think we have two governments on the stage today, both with a deep commitment to the energy transition and to benefiting in a whole of economy way from this transition, but at very different scales. And I think this is perhaps my question for you, sir. I mean, if you recall, at the start of India's presidency of the G20, we had discussed how what is a role that India's presidency of the G20 can play to leverage gains for the G77 and beyond, right? And especially because it was an opportune moment to be a emerging economy that was taking over the presidency right after one and then right before another one. And I think that there was a lot of foundation that was put in there. But what you were saying about bringing down the price of green hydrogen from $5 to $1, or even the point that Minister Krapa made about access to capital. I mean, in 2014, analysis that I did myself showed that 70% of the cost of a single unit of solar power in India was 70% of it was the cost of servicing debt and paying returns on equity. Today, that number is far lower. It's less than half. And it's also because technology costs in the meantime have also continued to decline. So proportionally, everything has shrunk. But it's also because we were able to do localization because of scale. But what is your advice for countries that just don't? They have growing demand, but they don't have gigawatt or hundreds of gigawatts demand in terms of scale. How can they participate more fully into this economic opportunity?
So 3 points. First is that India's G20 presidency was really the presidency of the Global South. And not only did we speak the language of the Global South, we brought African Union as a member of G20 and made it G21. So everything that, if you read the leaders' agreement, the New Delhi leaders' agreement, it really speaks the language of the Global South. Second point I want to make is that this cannot be done without adequate flow of resources, finance for the Global South. And when multilateral financial institutions were constituted, both IMF and World Bank, there was no climate crisis in the world. They are post-Bretton Woods institutions of the post-World War II. They need to be restructured, redesigned for the climate change of today. And therefore, we put this Larry Summer and N.K. Singh committee report, which clearly lays down a roadmap, because today, the international financial structure is heavily weighed against the global south. And the World Bank mobilizes 0.6 cents to a dollar of private resources. Today, it doesn't mobilize any resources at all. So our view was that it needs to get into multiplier impact through blended finance, through first loss guarantees, through credit enhancement, rather than do direct lending, and actually should become a climate bank, like the Asian Development Bank is doing to meet the requirement of the global south. And the third point I want to make is that actually many of us do not realize this, but 1% of the companies, of the listed companies, account for 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. 1% of the companies. They are not penalized. They are not penalized because there's lack of adequate flow of data to the stock markets, and stock markets do not put out the extent of greenhouse gas emissions that they are responsible for. The minute this is done across stock exchanges across the world, the market will penalize them. And there is a need for markets and citizens who put resources into the stock markets to penalize these companies and ensure that the fossil fuel economy comes to an end. And these three things, to my mind, are critical.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think that really does deserve a round of applause. Minister Krapa, this is the second time you've been here in under a year. It has been my privilege to be here both times with you. But one of the things that we have discussed while, at least on your previous mission to India on the sidelines of the energy ministers meeting of the G20, was perhaps the opportunity for collaborate. Perhaps we're just looking in the wrong place. Perhaps the opportunity is for South-South collaboration, not just in language, but in reality, in spirit, in demand aggregation, in acting together to be price makers rather than price takers. What is your hope when you're here again, especially in the wake of the access to capital or access to affordable capital crisis in Ghana that you just laid out previously?
Thank you. I think you're dead right on the point. I think collaboration between the global south, I think is crucial. And we were very happy with the stance that India took in terms of your presidency of the G20 and really bringing Africa on board in terms of the conversation, and actually also the framework, the takeaways from the G20, essentially identifying that the challenges of the global south really require us to be working together. And Minister has really harped home the point about the global financial architecture really being remodeled to attend to the need of financing the climate crisis and really helping the developing economies to be able to navigate our ways out of the conundrum of socioeconomic development, utilizing the resources that we have, fossil fuel resources, and also transitioning into greener fuels. We have the arena that we continue to dialogue amongst ourselves to see how we can find common pathways for transitioning and for mobilizing capital. We also really have to find a way for our regional banks to help really in de-risking, capital, so that a lot more financing can come into developing economies, the global south, in terms of renewables. We really also have to have a common framework. And just before I traveled, I saw a communication from the African Union really putting together an African-wide energy transition framework. Whereas countries like Ghana have really, taken the lead in terms of that framework and worked with SE for All for an investment plan. I saw an opportunity in the communique and quickly applied for it, which said that 5 initial countries could take advantage of a pilot program. And I made it clear that we're working with you, but that an arrangement that allows us to model a certain kind of pilot for, even if it is a project, and which gives some hope, and helps to inspire other countries to come along. That will be good. On the sidelines of the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi as well, the APRA, which was founded, Ghana has as well applied to be a member. And so I believe in such coalitions and such collaborations. We have applied to GEAP to be part of the battery energy storage systems. And we believe that such collaborations would help us really to bring in some financing, grant, if you like, patient, if you like, but the collaboration is key. If we had a plan that identified that not everyone must do the same things, but if critical minerals are concentrated here and there is natural gas there, and we can build a value chain for manufacturing and deployment and uptake, then I believe that should be the approach. And that's why we think that some of the countries that have taken the lead should show leadership and inspiration. I led a team from Ghana to Nigeria to work with the SE for All team there to really appreciate how Nigeria is taking the lead. And not long after that, I led a team to Dakar, who also really are trying to take away from Ghana in terms of what we have done. So I think that deepening that kind of collaboration and participation is crucial. And Minister is dead right. Remodeling the global financial architecture to focus more on the climate crisis and how we bring in more innovation, both in terms of unit economics, in terms of technology, in terms of the market, removing the risk significantly from the market, and also training our own domestic financial institutions in terms of pricing and putting together the financial arrangements for renewable energies, and also even local currency lending. I think these things we should focus on, and if we intensified and deepened working together as a continent, as a global south, I think we should be able to upskill very significantly in a short period of time.
Thank you so much. I recognize that we stand between you and dinner, but there is just so much good material here to discuss. But I do want to give you the opportunity to join the discussion. So I will come to the rest of the panelists, but perhaps alongside some questions from the audience, if that's okay. I'm not sure how we're doing this, but I can walk up to you with a mic. Oh, there is one here. Please keep your questions short, introduce yourself, and I'm relaying as I was told, questions only, no comments, please.
Thanks. Ron? Amit Paranspe, question for the entire panel. We briefly heard from Shrikant about modular reactors, but would like to hear from the entire panel a bit more about nuclear energy. I didn't hear a whole lot about that. Is that still a power energy of future or not?
Hi, Hi, I'm Janet Salem, and I work in climate tech, especially in climate data and analytics. So my question is perhaps for Mr. Kant, but also for Mr. Krapper. When you decarbonize your energy sector, you're decarbonizing not only your scope 1 and 2 emissions, but you're also decarbonizing your downstream sectors, both domestically and abroad in export markets in their scope 3 emissions. And now that there's a huge push on climate disclosures in the finance sector, it seems like a really big opportunity to leverage what you're doing. So my question to you is, how do you engage with your ministries of finance to push for mandatory disclosures? The way I've seen it so far in India and most of the world is that banks will not get involved in supporting this kind of climate disclosure, which helps your sectors then, access global markets, unless there's mandatory disclosure. So is there that dialogue with your ministers of finance? Thanks.
And then we have one more. Sorry, I unfortunately have time only for 3. So, but they're here, and while they're eating, feel free to quiz them. I've had a really good time quizzing them this evening. So take your turn after.
So good evening, Peter Hefler, Policy Director of Martin Center in Brussels. We went through the whole carbon cycle, but we left out one piece. That's the last one, for example, carbon storage and usage. And let aside the technical issues we're still facing, but I have never seen an economic model or business model in this relation. And in particular to the gentleman from the developing countries, is there anything in for you? I have projects only seen in the highly industrialized countries, but never any thoughts to what extent it can contribute to your value creation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to request each of the panelists to attempt the questions that have been posed, as well as offer kind of roundup remarks. And so just to remind you, we have a question on the role of nuclear, the role of financial regulation for reportage, and then on carbon capture and storage in developing countries, right? So maybe, Timur, if it's okay with you, we start with you, since 2 of those at least is a technology question. So you go first.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be trying to be brief on the role of nuclear. I think we all know that how incredibly cheap renewables have become. That is first and foremost important to note. At the same time, there is a number of countries that are looking into nuclear. They have made a pledge at COP28, so to expand the use of nuclear. So it's a very active discussion, I would say, and for many countries an important opportunity. I guess the question of nuclear SMRs here has a potential opportunity to overcome some of the current hurdles that the technology is suffering from nuclear waste disposal to the modularity of things, etc. But of course, this will require a significant degree of innovation here. On CCS, yeah, I think it was more a question towards the emerging economies representatives, but maybe just to say there is the historical use of CCS has been very much in EOR, of course, and these were very much full chain concepts, which has proven to be very difficult for some of the new applications that you actually need in order to make a meaningful CO2 contribution. So there's what we have seen over the last 2 years or so is how these full chain concepts have been broken up into part chain type of concepts. There is a certain surge in project announcements that is general for CCS applications, but also more towards those sectors where you actually need CCS the most when it comes to decarbonization. So in particular, the hard-to-abate sectors that Mr. Kant was referring to earlier. I'll leave it here maybe and give the others opportunity.
Thank you, Timur. Munya, would you like to go next?
Just to add an idea concerning the South-South cooperation, because I want to add some thoughts. The point is that the South-South cooperation is more than collaborative approach. It should be a link between countries at regional level. Even the transition, energy transition is a global issue, but to address, you should have solution at regional level. And the South-South cooperation, of course, can create this possibility by connection how we can have more integrated infrastructures, how we can have more standardization and harmonization regulations, and of course the exchange of information. And in this regard, I want just to mention rapidly the experience of Morocco, because Morocco has a very ambitious strategy in renewable energy under the leadership of His Majesty the King Mohammed VI. And this strategy was, of course, the first one is how we can enhance the part of renewable energy in our mix electricity, but also how we can create a more integrated connection with African countries in the region, especially in the Atlantic facade of ocean. And we see how we can generate more security, energy, and more developed activities. So this vision should be also taken into consideration when we want to address projects in transition, energy transition, because to maximize the return of revenue, to create more sustainable solution, and to also have more benefits for other countries, especially neighboring countries, it's important to have the integration as also solution that should be supporting the transition. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Manal, I think that's a really good opening for how you think there can be closer cooperation between developing countries as well in ways that really benefits local communities.
Before leading into that, a quick comment on the nuclear part, because I think it will really have to be, despite a lot of the concerns about it, with whether it's safety or others, if you look at all the other, even with green hydrogen, it's going to still be a top estimate of maybe 20% of global energy demand in 2050. So that is still not enough, and we really need all sources of energy. But of course, there are challenges there, and also one thing that could be also a challenge, particularly with the green hydrogen competitiveness of it. Aside from that, it's not viable. Some of the potentially least cost producers also have a problem with water, which water is the main component of also producing green hydrogen. And this would then, I think, also maybe I would lead from here into some of the cooperation points that you mentioned, because I think indeed there is a South-South cooperation. I mean, a lot of the countries are actually drawn by borders that were quite artificial. So I think there are really synergies that could be produced, whether it's electricity integration, whether it's water security, whether it's technology, connectivity of the grid. There's a lot of opportunities really at the region, South-South, and regional, of course. But also we can't forget still that globally, if we really want to accelerate energy transition, there's still things that we need to really advance, like the global commitments from the global north for the climate finance that are still not being met. And that is really going to be an important part of the puzzle, and ensuring that countries can obviously receive these the amount of finance and use it in their systems. But also another thing I think is on how do we measure and certify carbon? Because at the moment it is not really, they're different attempts, but they're not really the same globally, and that is really an impediment for technology, for ensuring that we can't have carbon leakage, for ensuring that different parts of whatever sources from different countries can be competitive. And without that, and I actually led a policy brief to the G20 on that as well, and from a few years ago, and that I think is still something that we're still lacking, that would be really important for advancing global energy transition and collaboration across countries.
So final word, and then you will have dinner. To Minister Krapa for a quick minute, and then Mr. Kant for a quick minute, and then dinner time.
Thank you, Kanika. You make us feel bad that we're blocking dinner, but I think this has been a good appetizer. Nuclear energy, we have nuclear very much in our plan. We envisage that 1/3 renewables, 1/3 gas, and 1/3 nuclear should really be the structure of the mix. We are currently engaging vendors. We put out a request for proposal, a further request. We are currently in the market engaging vendors from different parts of the world. I think that selection process should close soon, and then we continue the process. We think it's sensible to make it a base load and keep the grid stable, and then have renewables and the rest coming on. So that's very much part of the the conversation. In terms of mandatory disclosures, never has there been a time in our country when the Ministries of Finance and the Ministry of Energy have worked more closely together than now, especially because we recognize that the energy security and energy access issues require that the financial structure is very viable. And so we work very closely with them, and thankfully the Ministry of Finance sees itself as very much a part of the agenda to get energy more and more affordable, access also improved and dependable for our people, and financial mandatory disclosures and all of that is very much at the heart of the conversations that we have with them. CCUS, the pathway that we worked out together with SE for All identifies CCUS as one of the technologies that we deploy. So electricity, transport, industry, and CCUS are really the pathways that we have identified. Again, just before I traveled, I engaged with one of the firms that have expressed an interest in working with our government to deploy CCUS technology. And the approach that I quickly mentioned to them that we're very happy to take is to do an MOU and do a pilot with them and see how we can scale that up. So CCUS, basically also because we have some, degree of heavy industry in Ghana, steel, cement, and all of them, and we can take advantage of the technology to fasten the decarbonization plan. So very much a part of the agenda, and we hope that capital comes through eventually. Thank you.
So let me first respond to that question. My belief is that it'll be impossible for countries to attract capital and for private sector to enhance their value unless they don't go green. So going green will become an economic imperative for almost everyone. And if you don't do it, you will not be able to export to Europe by 2026. In India's case, the SEBI has mandated that you put out your ESG requirements and all that, your performance in public domain and so on. So, but I think all this will happen. It's inevitable. The market will punish you if you don't go green. You will not be able to attract capital anymore. So I'm a clear believer that it's imperative for every single country to take the route of going green. And number two, on the small modular reactor, the technology is absolutely ripe. It's very cost competitive. It's very, big nuclear projects have huge time and cost overruns, and therefore small modular reactors are the way forward. It's going to be a very big market in the coming days because from 200 kilos to about 10x size of that, you can do it through small modular reactor. The policy regimes in different countries regarding nuclear waste has to be brought in very clearly. That's all. Thanks.
Great. So I think this panel could go on just
Kanika,
because
I have to stop.
yes,
We've exceeded time.
Stopping. I was going to just say thank you to the panel. And also the message for all of you to take with you is that we must act together. The Global South must act in one voice, to demand together, to supply together, for more than anything, to hold the rest of the world to account and expect better. So with that, thank you very much to everyone on the panel, and bon appetit.